This spermaceti came out of the case of the sperm whale whose skeleton is on display in our Turner Gallery.
What's a case?
So the case is this, it's like basically this large tank of oil sitting just under the surface of the head. So that you got
It's his nose, right?
basically, because it's sitting on top of the skull, but the case is also sitting on top of another organ known as the junk. And the junk is the analog of the melon found in the other toothed whales, the other odontocetes.
Right in the head.
But the junk is this tank with these little cells separated by connective tissue, but the tank, the case, the spermaceti organ sits on top. And as the animal is making its clicks to echolocate, those sounds are traveling in between the junk and the case, through a nasal passage, out to a pair of phonic lips that actually face backwards towards the skull. It's just curved like an amphitheater.
Yeah, right.
And those clicks are traveling through this big tank of waxy oil. And then once it hits the air sac, up against the skull, it then travels down through the junk and out into the ocean. So this animal is using this giant nose full of oil to generate a lot of energy and a lot of sound so we can make sense of what's going on in the ocean around it.
So what is spermaceti? You
So
said
this
oil.
stuff, when it's sitting in the animal's head, it's basically liquid, but it's a waxy oil. So
Right.
it's a combination of things like triglycerides, similar to our fat, but in liquid form, along with these waxy esters. And whalers knew once they were going to dig a hole, cut a hole into the case of a sperm whale and start taking that stuff out, it was going to start to solidify because the colder temperature, it's colder outside the animal than it is inside. So it comes out and it begins to solidify, and we end up with this. And of course, this has been sitting in a bucket in a cooler, which is why it's in this solid form. If we left this out, just say this was August instead of March, it would be a lot more liquid than it is now.
So the reason we're doing this at all is we got an email from a man named Dawson Bloom who's doing a spec sheet for Netflix, and he asked if spermaceti in its raw state was flammable. And I didn't know the answer to that. I'm Mike Dyer, I'm the Curator of Maritime History, and I should know this stuff, and I didn't. So we figured, Bob and I got our heads together and said, wouldn't it be cool if we could get some raw spermaceti and see if it does in fact burn? And so, Mr. Dawson, here's the answer to your question. This stuff does not burn. It is melting, but you can see we've got a bright yellow flame on there. It's not a super hot flame, but it's a flame, and it's melting the wax as you would expect the wax to melt, but it's not burning.
And this gets at another point that I just remembered, is that all that oil in the case, all that energy, can't be processed by the whale as energy to survive. We know that these animals have oily bone marrow, and the oil in the bone marrow can be used as an energy source, especially when they're migrating and not eating. But sperm whales actually can't take this energy and turn it into something usable for daily survival. It's actually toxic to their health, which is why you would see, or whalers might see, rather thin, emaciated sperm whales with heads that almost look normal size, because they couldn't take the energy out of the oil in the head and turn it into, they couldn't metabolize it, is probably the right word.
So this leads us to another question, and I don't have the answer to, is that at what point does sperm oil burn? Because it was a beautiful illuminant, and
the melting point, I think I was just having a read on this, I think it's 111 degrees Fahrenheit.
So it has to be processed to a certain point, and after that it'll burn?
I would think so. Get the wax out of the way, perhaps.
So the pressing, so when the spermaceti in a cool temperature is that solid that we see that once the heat's gone, it starts to solidify. So that spermaceti be packed in bags and put into a big press, a big wooden press, and it would press the oil out of the spermaceti itself, and that first running of the oil was considered the finest. What was it? The winter
press.
the first winter press, and then that material. I think that material would be further processed as well, so that it could be turned into oil for lamps, for the illumination that made whaling such an important industry. Spermaceti itself, as Bob was saying earlier, as we were saying outside, after several pressings, a winter pressing, a spring pressing, a summer pressing, and then it's what's called a taut press. So after it's been pressed a bunch of times, it would be pressed again and bleached, so that it became beautiful white solid wax. And that beautiful white solid wax was what spermaceti candles were, with a cotton wick, and they burned beautifully, beautiful light. And you made a note in your earlier notes I read about candle power.
Candle power. And I'm not going to remember the exact numbers, but somebody in England decided that they were going to measure candle power based on the amount of illumination given off by a candle of like 1/6. I forget the measurements, but there was a standard set for candle power based on the illumination given off by a spermaceti.
One spermaceti candle. Yeah. So that's the answer, Mr. Dawson, Mr. Bloom. I hope that helps you out, and it certainly helped us out.